Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the annual Krzysztof Michalski lecture, named after the man who founded this excellent institute and acted for many years as its first rector. This event is always special, and we work hard to reflect that in our choice of speaker. I'm not only confident, I know that you will not be disappointed with this year's lecturer, the Canadian historian, Professor Margaret MacMillan. But it's not only Margaret's lecture that we've come to celebrate and listen to today, and why this event is so special. And that's because in the next few weeks, two of our number, I'm sad to say, will be taking their leave as permanent fellows at the Institute. Both have brought particular gifts to the work of the IWM, and I'm glad to say that both will still be involved in different ways in the future in the work of the Institute. To thank them for their dedication, their output, and their bonhomie, we do not want to see them go empty-handed. Catherine Younger has been a remarkable inspiration behind our Ukraine program since joining the IWM. In particular, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, she worked tirelessly to get the Documenting Ukraine program on its feet, providing invaluable resources and encouragement to academics, writers, artists, filmmakers, and public intellectuals who sought to record quotidian life in Ukraine during this vile war. And as she reminded us earlier today, one of the Documenting Ukraine grantees is now an Oscar winner for 20 Days in Mariupol. If you haven't seen the film, all I can say is watch it, full stop. I believe that the work that Kate has done here will prove vital for future historians and researchers as we continue to build up this remarkable archive. It is our good fortune that she will continue working with the program from her new perch in Glasgow, and we have fashioned her leaving gift with her new location in mind. And then on to our second permanent fellow, Ivan Vejvoda. Not just a permanent fellow to me, but a close friend for many decades. We experienced the horrors of the wars in his former country, Yugoslavia, together. He has brought immense wisdom and experience to this institute with an unparalleled knowledge of the Balkans and its many travails. But he has also persuaded countless fascinating individuals to join the IWM as fellows in the project he has managed since its inception, Europe's Futures. This has expanded our horizons from Belfast to Odessa, and of course, Cres in Croatia, where the annual symposium of the program takes place in very balmy conditions. For him, we have selected a gift which will enable him, and I hope me, to continue talking late into the night over a dram or two. Kate, Ivan, can you please come up? So, and now on to the main event. Thanks so much to Kate and Ivan for your efforts. A quick reminder that after today's event, we are hosting a flying dinner down below in the dining room, which if you are here in the room, you are most cordially invited to. But as I say, now to the main event, the Krzysztof Michalski Memorial Lecture. If you look up Professor MacMillan's biography, likely as not, you will be bamboozled by the alphabet soup which follows her name. Testimony to the countless honours conferred on her by Canada and the United Kingdom. For just over a quarter of a century, she was Professor of History at Ryerson University in Toronto before leaving to become Provost of Trinity College in Toronto for 5 years. She then spent 10 years from 2007 as Warden of St. Anthony's College, which means we have 2 former wardens of St. Anthony's serving on our board at the IWM, Tim Garton-Ash being the other. She's been a professor of international history at Oxford, an honorary fellow at St. Hilda's, and a most welcome member of our board. Her books are too numerous to mention them all, but I would like to highlight one, Peacemakers, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and its attempt to end war, which had a particular influence on my own thinking about the First World War and its consequences. And then, most recently, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. Given what is going on the very moment that I am speaking now, Margaret's talk this evening, New World Orders, Past, Present and Future, could hardly be more relevant. Margaret, please come up to the stage to give us your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Rector. That was extremely kind, and if you weren't being a rector, I'm sure you'd be a diplomat somewhere, but very kind indeed, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure to be in Vienna, and it's particularly nice and an honor to be giving the annual Krzysztof Michalski Lecture in memory of someone who created this institute. And it has flourished, and it is, I think, a wonderful thing to see, and long may it flourish. We're looking at very strange circumstances, changing so quickly. If you look at your phones, probably President Trump has just tweeted something extraordinary. Every sort of moment of the news is a rapidly changing situation. Even a year ago, the world had its problems, but it seemed somehow more stable. We knew that there was conflict in the Middle East. We knew there was, of course, the war going on in Ukraine. There were tensions between the United States and China, tensions between China and India. But I think few people could have predicted the multiple and overlapping crises that have got even worse in the past year. We have, I don't need to tell you, we have war in the Middle East, we have war in the center of Africa, we have war in Sudan, we have, of course, the war in Ukraine, where there is no sign of a ceasefire, in fact, in any of these wars. And more terrifying, I think, is that the world's greatest power, the United States, the hegemon, which since the end of the Cold War has kept a sort of balance in the world, is now like a very powerful car driven by a teenager who's having trouble with his hormones on an emotional roller coaster, and who has impatience with any rules. If his parents tell him not to drive so quickly, if others say you're going to kill someone, he gets even angrier. I mean, I think we are looking again, and as an historian I feel this very much, at just how important individuals at critical moments can be in history. Not always. I mean, I think we'd all rather live in a world where it doesn't matter who's prime minister or who's president or who's dictator. I'd rather live in a world in which I might not even know the names of my political leaders, but at the moment we're not doing that. We're living in a world in which a single individual or a number of individuals, but I'm thinking particularly of what's happening in the United States, has the capacity to send not only his own country, but much of the world down one path or another. And I think we have to accept this. This is not something that the normal structural analyses can explain. I think it's very much the person and the office and the power at a particular time. And I think we can think of this in the 20th century. I mean, imagine the history of the 20th century if, for example, Adolf Hitler had been killed in the trenches in the First World War, or if Winston Churchill had been killed when he was knocked down by a car on Fifth Avenue in New York. at the beginning of the 1930s, or if Stalin had died of an appendix, which he had during the Civil War. You think of subtracting those people from history, and somehow it is possible to say that history might well have been very, very different indeed. What is, I think, also deeply concerning to those of us who, for all its faults, have respected the United States, have seen it as a hopeful country in a very complicated world, have hoped that it will continue to express the high ideals with which it was founded. I think what is very worrying is that the United States itself is in increasing, I think, internal disarray, and increasingly has antagonisms among its people. The increase, not just in violent language, but the increase in actual violence. The assassination of the Democratic senator recently, the state senator. This is very worrying indeed, and just the sheer number of guns that Americans have, which I believe is more than enough for every man, woman, and child living in the United States. It is also worrying that the United States seems to be conducting a series of actions and policies which are harming it. And it's very hard to think of, I was talking to Michael Ignatieff about this just before we started here. It's very hard to think of another case in history where a nation has so deliberately thrown away dependable allies. You know, I'm Canadian. You know, we've never been a threat to the United States. Well, occasionally we've taught them a lesson. I mean, they tried to invade us in 1812, or invade the Canadian colonies in 1812, and they were defeated. And the British obligingly went down and burnt the White House on our behalf. We have had our moments with the United States, but on the whole, we have the longest undefended border in the world. We have worked very well together in a number of institutions. We have an enormous trading relationship. So why alienate Canada? It just seems pointless. I mean, if you want to put pressure on Canada as the United States, you can do it. If you want something more from Canada, you can probably get it. But it seems to me utterly pointless to alienate Canada to the point at which we all in Canada go to grocery stores and you can get an app for your phone. I have one called Buy Beaver, and you scan barcodes. It sounds ridiculous, but it's an act of defiance. We see it like this. You scan barcodes on groceries and it will tell you where it's made. And there are guerrilla shoppers who go around turning upside down anything made in the United States. I mean, this is all pointless, but it indicates a type of public mood. And we never thought we'd be doing things like this. But it's not just that. It's not throwing away allies in a way that doesn't seem really to make much sense. It seems pointless and destructive. But what's also happening is the United States is damaging its own capacity to do what it always did so well, and that is innovate, do research, be at the forefront of science and technology. Its attacks on the universities, its attacks on knowledge itself, the behavior of many of the cabinet secretaries who seem to be absolutely hostile to any notion of research and testing of ideas. This is all something which is very, very difficult to understand. And where it will leave the United States, I think, in, say, 5, 6 years, will not be easy to repair. Apart from anything else, the United States is also destroying its own capacity or damaging its own capacity to understand the rest of the world. The State Department is in turmoil. It's losing a lot of its experts. The attempts to destroy things like National Public Radio, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, these are all things which are going to make it more difficult for the United States, not only to project its power on the world, but to understand the rest of the world. There will not be the people who know the culture, know the language, know the histories of the countries with which the United States is dealing. And so it is, I think, a very difficult time. And of course, the other great crises, the ones that are the existential crises for the whole of humanity, are still there. We have climate change. The predictions are now even worse. This is probably going to be the hottest summer after last year, which was the hottest summer the world has known since measurements started. This summer will probably be even hotter. We will have, for sure, other pandemics, even though the American health at the moment is run by Robert Kennedy, who seems to think that all you need to do is eat a proper diet and pandemics will not come near you. And so we face a series of overlapping crises, from the existential to the ones which are putting international relations into turmoil, and to the internal crises that a number of countries are facing. And a number of people are inventing new words for it, because it's very difficult to think, again, of similar periods, not affecting the whole world at any rate. And so the words polycrisis and permacrisis are coming into the language. Adam Tooze, the historian, has said the whole is even more dangerous than the sum of the parts. And it's very hard to disagree with him. We are living in a moment when the crises feed off each other and amplify each other. So how can history help with this? You may wonder, as we're facing this unprecedented situation and looking to the future. And I think where history can help is not to give us clear answers. History doesn't do that. History has lessons, but it has too many lessons. You have to pick out which lessons you need. But what history can do is, I think, remind us of other types of societies, other ways of doing things. In the present, we tend to think that the way we do it is the only way to do it, the only possibility. And I think what history can do is remind us of alternatives. And so if we're looking at world orders, which I want to talk about tonight, there are other models than the rather chaotic one we have at the moment. There are other ways of organizing the world, and we should at least consider those, because some of these are very likely to be tried in the next few years. And I think importantly, history helps us to understand others. I think you can't understand a nation and you can't understand the leaders of that nation unless you know something of their history. You know, you cannot understand Russia, in my view, unless you know what Russia has been through, unless you know the views that Russians have of their own history, and unless you know the history of the Russian leader, of Vladimir Putin himself, what he went through. He saw the end of communism. He saw the humiliation of what had been the great power of the Soviet Union. And I think that is a very important force in helping to shape the ways in which he sees the world and the sorts of things he wants to do. And so history, I think, helps with understanding. And finally, I think what it can do is help with warnings. What if? If we do this, what is likely to happen? At the moment, we're facing and we're watching, there's nothing any of us can do about it, the escalation of tension and threat and attack in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. And there's a very real possibility that the United States is going to intervene. Trump is sending out, like a faulty radio, all sorts of contradictory signals. And so it's very difficult to know what he intends to do. But he has threatened that Iran will face fire and destruction like it has never faced before. And if the United States gets involved in this war, then I think we'll see a very serious escalation indeed. Iran may not be able to strike back with conventional means against the United States, but it will for sure strike back in other ways. I think we can see an increase, and probably will anyway, in attacks on soft targets that are easier to get, use of radicalized supporters of Iran in different countries. We don't know what's going to happen, but I think at least history can say, what if? If we do this, should we be careful? Unfortunately, President Trump doesn't know any history, or knows very little. You've probably seen the clip, or you can see it on YouTube, where he's talking about George Washington, his great hero, although he sees himself as a better president than George Washington, of course. But George Washington, Trump said in his first term, was a great president. He created an ally. He created the American forces at Valley Forge to fight the British. They came out of their camps in the spring, and they went and they took all the British airfields. They took all the British ports. They took all the British bases. You know, this is someone whose understanding of history is, I would say, not perfect. So I think history, by looking back, we can perhaps help ourselves look into the future. And if we can't ask questions, then without formulating the questions, we don't have much hope of being able to try and find out the sort of answers we might want. I mean, one of the views from the past of an international order is the Hobbesian one, that the international order is anarchic. It is made up of competing states who think only of their own interests. He of course, lived through a period of war in Europe, the devastating 30 Years' War, plus the revolution in Britain in the 17th century, and the Civil War in Britain in the 17th century. And so his view of what humanity was capable of and the organization of relationships among groups of people was a very dark one indeed. But even then, there was always even in the most dreadful days of the 30 Years' War, there were always some ways that nations dealt with each other. They had to exchange prisoners, or they had to have temporary ceasefires, or they had to perhaps switch sides. And so even in the Hobbesian anarchic world, there were rules of a sort, some ways of actually communicating with others. Clearly for Hobbes, force was the key factor, and he saw that in civil society as well. that behind any government, however much those being ruled appeared to consent, was the threat of force, what he called Leviathan. And for Hobbes, force was the determining factor in international relations, and interests were the dominant motivation of those engaged in international relations. But it's always been, I think, more complicated than that. Powerful nations are powerful not just because of what they possess, not just because of the amounts of weapons they have, or the amounts of armies they have, or the amounts of soldiers they have, but they're powerful also because, at least up to a point, those being ruled over by them, and in some cases those they conquer, accept their authority. And so power can get you so far, but sheer power, naked power, I think, is never sufficient. That governments that depend entirely on force, in the end, become fragile and don't last. And there's always an element of acceptance, an element of recognition that the government has some sort of authority. And so in the Middle Ages, the authority came from tradition, as it came through much of history. It came from hierarchy. But in Europe, it also came from the church. The church tried repeatedly to impose a peace of Christendom, tried repeatedly to regulate international relations among the different powers in Europe. It formulated rules about when you could fight and whom you could attack. Clergy traveling on holy business were not to be attacked. This was self-interest of a rather obvious sort. But you didn't fight on holy days as well. And for the most part, those who were called themselves Christian, even if their behavior was very unchristian, accepted those rules, sometimes under a certain amount of pressure. There was a famous French bishop, I think he was, who called in the local feudal lords who'd been fighting for a meeting, and he said, "You cannot go on like this. You've been attacking the church. This is very costly." And they all sort of grumbled and said, "No, we're not going to stop." And he said, "I have brought a few people to help persuade you that you might want to agree to stop fighting and accept the peace imposed by the church." And he surrounded the whole meeting place with his own soldiers, and they agreed. So I think there have always been, throughout history, attempts to recognize authority, attempts to use authority. In the present, as with religion, we've seen authority coming from ideology. The French Revolution and the French revolutionary armies tried to create an international relations where they spread their ideas, where Europeans would come to accept a particular view of the relationship between the ruled and the rulers, and that there would be no more conflict between nations because they were all somehow accepting the same sort of pattern. And then, of course, in the 20th century, there was the Marxist view that with the spread of Marxist ideas and with the triumph eventually of the proletariat, there would be no more nationalities at all, that there would be no boundaries because the proletariat would be international in its nature. I mean, I think one of the things that Marxism never really grappled with was the force of nationalism, which is, I think, like a religious ideology. But there also always been, or not always, but since certainly the 18th century and into the present time, ideas of a different sort of international order. An international order which is based on cooperation among peoples. For those who thought like this, trade was very important, that the more the nations of the world traded with each other, the more they would get on with each other, the more they would understand each other, the more they would understand that they all had interests in common, that to fight each other was wasteful, was foolish, that they simply wouldn't do it. Before the First World War, there was a very famous book by an English journalist on trying to end war, and he argued there was absolutely no point in European nations fighting each other because they could get what they wanted from each other without the cost and the trouble of war. And so you do have alternative views always, even when sheer force seems to be dominating. The idea of, particularly as the world became more not more democratic, but as liberal ideas began to move around the world, you did get the idea that we could live in a world in which we had laws and regulations trade with each other, just as you did in civil societies. And in civil societies, those laws, those regulations, shared prosperity would help to create a sort of stability. But again, we always have to remember there are always the alternatives, and a lot of these alternatives were non-European. And we tend to assume that the categories that were developed in Europe were ones that became universalized, which is true, but there were other alternatives in the shape of the Ottoman Empire or in the shape of the Chinese Empire or the various empires in Central Asia. How international relations worked until the 19th century, of course, was regional, but the types of orders that were developed in different regions, of course, when the world became more global, began to become universal, people began to think of them applying to the world in general. So liberal international order, authoritarian orders, or anarchic orders, as Hobbes would have it, but there were also the imperial orders, where you had a single empire in the case of the Roman Empire, or in the case of the British Empire, in the case of the big European empires, keeping peace. Again, I think by a combination of force, but also by a combination of appearing to have some sort of authority. The Roman Empire was not run just on force alone, although its armies were very effective. It was run because enough people within it accepted that it was a form of government that worked for them. And it's very significant, I think, that peoples moved into the Roman Empire and not out, because what the Roman Empire gave them was not, of course, democracy or participation, but what the Roman Empire gave them was stability and security. It meant they could travel from one part of the Roman Empire to another, that they could be secure in their property, that they could trade, that they could enjoy the benefits of their work. And that was true of the British Empire as well. When the British Empire began to be built in India, again, there was a pattern of Indian entrepreneurs, for example, moving into the areas dominated by the British because they knew at least they would be able to keep the profits of their labor. A lot of Indian princely states were arbitrary, despotic, not offering the sort of security that people wanted. So you had orders run by empires, still very common. I think we had thought that the age of empire was over when the big European empires disappeared after 1945, and of course what we're seeing is the reemergence of empire. It's probably, if not the most common, one of the most common forms of government in the world, and one of the most common forms of managing the international order. And then you had, certainly with the British in the 19th century, a hegemonic power, which was not just an imperial power, but was a power which was able to maintain peace or impose its rules on the rest of the world. The British Navy was ruling the seas. Britain was the dominant power. The United States was the hegemonic power after the end of the Cold War, although it, I think, probably is not going to be so for much longer. Again, we had balances of power where you would get combinations of states balancing against each other, or you would get a hegemonic power where lesser powers, other powers would bandwagon against it, that the resentment of the hegemonic power would lead to a movement. It was very fluid and very unstable, rather like the balance of power, because states were constantly jockeying within it to try and find advantage. But a hegemonic power was always in danger of having other lesser powers bandwagon against it to try and limit its power. And so you get this constant shift in influence and power. We also had, and these are overlapping categories, but these are ideas that came out, certainly by the end of the 19th century, spheres of influence, that great powers would dominate in their own regions, and they would allow other powers to dominate in their regions. This is one that is being talked about a lot at the moment. It's being talked about in Washington. President Trump seems to see the world in these terms, that the United States will be dominant in the Western Hemisphere, China will be dominant in East Asia, Russia will be dominant in its neighborhood, including Eurasia. He doesn't really pay much attention to the European Union, but it would be another potential sphere of influence. I mean, the idea is it's very transactional, which again reflects, I think, a lot of President Trump's thinking, that nations will control their own areas and respect the spheres of influence of other nations. My own view, and history seems to show this, is it doesn't work like that. A sphere of influence, again, like a balance of power or a hegemonic power which creates opposition, is inherently unstable. That there will be points always at which spheres of influence meet, and that is where they will compete. There will be conflict, there will be friction along those common areas. That if you are if you are controlling a particular part of the world, you don't want anyone else interfering with it. But there will be those who want to. And so I think spheres of influence, again, will be unstable, just like a balance of power. A power is, and this, I think, helped to lead this. You certainly see it happening before the First World War. Nevertheless, having said that international relations can be very unstable and can be very dangerous, there was always an alternative. There were always people hoping that we could manage international relations in a way that would bring an end to war and remove the causes of war and enable nations to live, if not happily with each other, at least at peace with each other. And so you began to get the development of ideas, many centuries old in some cases, of ways of managing relations among states that would be to the benefit of all. And so the laws of war, the ways of declaring war, the ways of ending war. I mean, these are things that have a very long history indeed, go back into the past, and I think these have been important. What made it particularly important, I think, was by the 19th century, the world had become globalized. And so a lot of these models applied to particular regions, but what you got by the end of the 19th century was a recognition that the world was no longer just a series of regions. The world was also something called a global order. The growth of trade, the growth of communications, the linking together of the nations of the world through steamships, through the telegraph, which in its own way was as great an innovation and as important an innovation and impactful an innovation as the internet. The ways in which the nations of the world were being brought together into relations with each other, even if they didn't want it. I mean, Japan had managed, under the Tokugawa, quite successfully for at least 2 centuries to keep foreigners at bay and to maintain its island independence until Commodore Perry, with his warships, arrived in the middle of the 19th century, and other great powers came as well. And the Japanese, painfully, and in some cases with resistance, were forced to recognize that their isolation could no longer be maintained, that they had to some way engage with this world in which they were living. And so you began to get the development of a truly global way of thinking about the global order, incorporating many of the ideas that had developed of earlier orders. The notion of a piece of Christendom, the notion of a Hobbesian world. I mean, these ideas about international order began to apply not just to regions, but began to apply to the globe. And so you get, in the 19th century, and earlier too, but certainly in the 19th century, a tremendous burst of thinking about the world and how it can be managed. There's a very interesting and very time-wasting thing you can do on Google called Ngram. I don't know if anyone's ever done it. You search for the use of words between certain dates, and they've scraped the internet, and it grew out of Google Books, I think. And so they've got a huge mass of material. And if you look, I did a search from, I think it was 1800 to 1914 for the word international. And for the most part, it's a very flat line, and then it suddenly begins to spike before the First World War. And I think it's partly because of the increasing tensions in Europe, which were, because they were also affecting empires, were affecting the world as a whole. And so you can see the thinking, or you get a sense that the thinking is beginning to move in a more global difference. And you can see challenges to the existing ideas, the existing structures. There were challenges increasingly to state-based order, challenges to hierarchies of power. It reflected changes that were taking place in society. It reflected the growing urbanization of peoples, particularly in industrial nations. It reflected the spread of constitutional ideas. And these were truly international. One of the things that Linda Colley did in her book on constitutions was show how ideas about constitutions traveled around the world. That when Haiti had its revolution against France and they're trying to think of what sort of constitution they would have, they looked at the Swedish constitution or the American constitution. So we are really getting a global marketplace of ideas. And these alternatives begin to challenge the notion that it is all about state power. It is all about the competition among different states. I think what's also happening is that the idea that humanity is a unity is beginning to spread. Immanuel Kant certainly assumed that there was a unity in humanity. So therefore, ways of governing and ways of managing relations among nations were not the preserve of the Europeans or the preserve of the Chinese and their neighbors. They were, in fact, something universal. And so you begin to get attempts to establish rules which are truly international, rules that we respected. And Immanuel Kant wrote a very interesting small piece called Peace, Perpetual Peace. He even made a joke, which I don't think he made very much. There was a joke, he said he starts off Perpetual Peace with saying, let us imagine an innkeeper, and he has a sign on which it says Perpetual Peace. But the picture, pub signs often have pictures on them, the picture is of a graveyard. This is his only joke, so it's not great. But he called for, he said that one day, or at least he hoped, that one day there will be a special sort of league that can be called a League of Peace, aiming to make an end to all wars forever. And he believed that this would only happen when humanity itself changed. What he called the crooked timber of humanity would become straighter. That the cultural and moral change, the abandonment of some of the old feudal ideas about power and war would be abandoned. The end would come, he hoped. He didn't predict it, but he hoped it. The end would come to monarchical and aristocratic domination, and that peoples, and he never really explained how this would happen, that peoples would have more control over their rulers, and that people would, by cultural change and moral change, abandon the idea of war and submit themselves to coercive laws that would help to prevent war. I mean, a great deal of internationalism and thinking about the international order has been to do with trying to get rid of war. And as war became more deadly and more encompassing, as it did in the 19th century, and then certainly in the centuries afterwards, this became, I think, extremely important. You also got, in the 19th century, an increasing attempt coming from many different quarters to create rules and laws, ways of behaving internationally that would bind states so they could no longer act with a completely free hand. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which was established in Geneva, was one of the first such attempts. And I think part of its significance is it was multilateral. It wasn't just a bargain between two different countries. It was a multilateral organization, assuming, I think, therefore, that states have something in common, that you can actually have a community. You can have a community of states. You got far more attention paid to international law, and the work of earlier theorists like the Dutch scholar Grotius now became very important. People began to talk about the ways in which a whole legal regime could be developed to deal with injustices, crimes, and again, how it could be made to prevent war. I mean, one of the key things, I think, always between trying to set up international orders that work for the benefit of stability, benefit of all, if possible, was the need to avoid war. And such pressures and such thinking became particularly strong, of course, after dreadful wars. And the Peace of Westphalia emerged out of the 30 Years' War. The idea that state sovereignty shouldn't be infringed only came after the horrors of the 30 Years' War. And you will see it, of course, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where the powers of Europe, these are not yet, of course, democratic, but the powers of Europe come together to try and set up a system that will prevent anything like the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars from happening again. And the Congress of Vienna was about bringing peace, dealing with the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, but it was also looking to the future. And those nations which made the peace at the Congress of Vienna, including France, it was a very interesting example of including a defeated nation. Britain, Prussia, Russia, France, and sorry, I'm forgetting one. Britain, Russia, Prussia, France. No, sorry? Austria, sorry. Oh, God. Well, I think at this point I'll just give up. I'm so sorry. I should have done it alphabetically. But they've transformed themselves into the Concert of Europe. When the war ended, when the peace was made, they became the Concert of Europe, which acted, yes, in a conservative way to repress revolution, but it did also provide stability. It acted to stop potential conflicts that could have got out of control. And for the most part, it kept a sort of peace in Europe for a relatively long period of time. And it lingered on even into the beginning of the 20th century, when there was still attempts to revive some notion of a concert of Europe, which would try and deal with the wars that were breaking out in the Balkans. And so after a great catastrophe, I think is a time when people begin to think of how to avoid it. And of course, the First World War was an even greater catastrophe in a way. I mean, the French Revolutionary Wars was tremendously costly, but the First World War, when populations were bigger, was on an even bigger scale, and the capacity of these industrialized nations to kill each other and to destroy much of the infrastructure of Europe was also that much greater. And so when the powers met in Paris to talk about how to end the First World War, of course they wanted to talk about how to punish those they felt were guilty of starting it, and that was a very important part of what they were doing. But they were also thinking internationally. They were being forced into it in a sense because they represented the powers of the world, and it was an extraordinary event that lasted for 6 months. And peoples from around the world, citizens, petitioners, small countries, would-be countries, came to Paris because it was seen as something where the world could be changed, and you could get something that you had been waiting for a very long time. And there was great hope, I think, of the Paris Peace Conference. Later on, the disillusionment set in, but there was great hope that it would, in fact, build a better world. Many of the ideas that had been floating around Europe in the 19th century, ideas about the importance of trade in linking nations together, ideas about the importance of laws, ideas about the importance of concerted action, multilateral treaties to try and remove the causes of war. These had been around, but they were pulled together partly by General Smuts, the South African general, but also by Woodrow Wilson, the American president. And it was really Woodrow Wilson who expressed them so clearly. He was a great orator, not always a very clear thinker, but he spoke to people, and he had made a number of speeches, including the famous 16 points, before the war ended. And when he arrived in Europe, because he took place in the peace conference itself, when he arrived in Europe, he was greeted in many quarters as a sort of savior. Apparently Italian families had pictures of him next to the Madonna in their houses. When he got off the boat in Brest, there were huge crowds. They said virtually every living creature in the port of Brest had turned out to see him. And that night, he and his party took a train to Paris, and his doctor got up in the middle of the night and looked out, and there were just silent French people lining the railway tracks as the presidential train passed by. I mean, the hopes were immoderate. There was hopes that somehow a much better world would emerge, but he did speak for something. He encapsulated and pulled together these ideas. He talked about a free association of powers. He talked about the spread of democratic values, and this was something that was becoming, I think, very much an article of faith, that the more democratic peoples became, the less likely they would to be to fight each other. He talked about collective security, where the nations of the world would get together, and if one of them was attacked, they collectively would act against the aggressor. He talked about removing the sources of conflict, getting rid of trade wars, damaging trade wars, getting rid of poverty, getting rid of arms trade, trying to do something about the different rates of development in the world, getting rid of slavery. These were ideas that, as I say, had been around, but were extremely important. And they came together in the League of Nations. And the document that founded the League of Nations was known as a covenant, a religious term. Wilson's own father had been a clergyman, because I think he saw it, and many saw it as a sacred pledge to make the world a better place, so that there would not ever be a war like this again. It did not work entirely. The League was set up. It wasn't, I think, as much of a failure as people have thought, that it did provide a way for nations to settle their disputes. Italy and Greece managed to settle the dispute through the mechanisms of the League of Nations in the 1920s. The League did set up a number of very successful subsidiary or allied organizations. The original body, which became the World Health Organization, was a League organization. The International Labour Organization was part of the League. There were attempts made to try and create a framework in the world which would try and remove the causes of tensions among nations and bring them closer together. Unfortunately, as we know, there were alternative models that began to be floated around. There was, of course, always the great challenge that came from what was now the Soviet Union, the Marxist model, where there would be an international destruction of capitalism and the spread of this international proletarian socialism, and then finally pure communism, which didn't happen, but it was a very powerful idea and appealed to a great many people. It failed, I think, partly because there were other models, models of the Japanese militarists, which argued that Japan could only, who became increasingly powerful in Japan in the 1930s, who argued that Japan could only defend itself, get what it needed, including raw materials and space for its people and space for its factories by conquest. It failed because Hitler took over in Germany and again embarked on a course of conquest, and Mussolini in Italy became more and more imperial-minded, more and more aggressive. The League might have survived if it hadn't been for the Great Depression, which enabled some of these far-right nationalist and aggressive parties to get into power. But it was something that is seen, I think, widely as a failure. During the Second World War, there was a recognition again, and this came much earlier, interestingly enough. In the First World War, there was very little discussion of what sort of international order there should be when the war ended until very shortly before the First World War ended. In the Second World War, the British and the Americans in particular started talking about what sort of world order they could try and build as early as 1940. Even before the United States came into the war, there were groups thinking about this in Washington and discussions of it. And the same thing was true in Britain. And they initially thought of reviving the League and then decided that it was too much associated with failure. And so they decided to build a new organization, the United Nations, which would, in theory, have more power than the League had, would have more ability to act against an aggressor. And again, however, the idea that you cannot just stop war by force, that you need to remove the causes of war itself, was a very important part of the United Nations. I mean, the covenant, the founding document of the United Nations talks about getting rid of war, but then it talks about removing the causes of war, removing the competition among nations, the inequities among nations, the unfairnesses among nations that will lead to war. It talked about, again, a rule of law. It talked about international agreements. It talked about the rights of peoples for self-determination. It never was able to fully establish itself because of the Cold War, but it remained, I think, a very important institution. It shifted from trying to prevent war to trying to deal with the consequences of war, but it was a step forward in internationalization and thinking in international ways. The Cold War ended, as you know, at the end of the 1980s, and there was, I think, for a time, a belief, certainly in the West, that the liberal order had triumphed. The famous Francis Fukuyama essay, when he talked about the end of history, that there are no alternatives now, that there will have to be a liberal international order and there will have to be a democratic spread of democracy throughout the world. And almost immediately, we began to get challenges to that world order. In the 1990s, there was the shock of the breakup of Yugoslavia, in which rules which had been painstakingly established were violated, and in the end, the war was only brought to an end in Bosnia by the use of force. We had the genocide in Rwanda in the 2000s. There was the spread of radical terrorist groups, some of them inspired by religion, others inspired by ideology. The attacks on the United States of 9/11, attacks in European cities, terrorist attacks. And then you had the Western countries making what it's easy to see it in retrospect. At the time, I thought the invasion and occupation of Iraq was possibly not a bad thing. I thought if a dreadful dictator like Saddam Hussein disappears, it's not so bad. In fact, I think it was so bad, and the people of Iraq have paid the most terrible price for it, as did the people of Afghanistan. But I think who also paid a price for it were the powers that got involved. And again, the United States, which apparently was the world's hegemon after 1990, lost a great deal of moral and other authority. Great powers depend on their credibility, and I think the United States and its allies lost credibility in both Afghanistan and Iraq. So where are we now? We've been looking back, I think, a lot of us historians, at other periods in history where the international order is challenged. There are parallels with both the period before 1914 and the period before 1939. The weakening of faith in liberal values and institutions within democracies and in international relations. The apparent inability of democracies to deal with challenges both external and internal. The dangers of a globalized world economy. We're all now aware of this. What happens when a downturn or catastrophes ripple through an international order. We've seen a revival of great power rivalry, the US and China, but we should also remember India and China and the possibilities of conflict. And I think there's a great danger here, because nations that are rivals and suspect each other begin to make preparations for war, and they begin to move from making preparations just in case to making preparations which assume the war is going to come. I was giving a talk to some mid-career military in Washington last year, and I was struck. We were in a seminar, and I was struck by how they said, when we fight China, not if. And I think that's very dangerous. That's very like what happened before the First World War, and it's very like what happened at the beginning of the Second World War. Once you begin to assume that a war is coming against an adversary, you begin to interpret everything that adversary does as confirmation of a bias that you already have, and you begin to plan for the ifs, not for the ifs, you begin to plan for the whens. What I find is also extremely dangerous is that a taboo which existed really since the end of the Second World War, that seizure of territory from one state by another state would not be recognized internationally, would not be accepted as legitimate, and that taboo has gone. It went probably a bit when China took Tibet, although it made historic claims for it. It went certainly when Israel annexed part of the Golan Heights and proclaimed its sovereignty over it. And it's gone, of course, with the actions of President Putin, when he simply conquered territories and paid, well, Russia has paid a penalty for it, but he has still, this has not been challenged sufficiently, I think. We've seen the seizure of territory in Africa as well. And the danger there is that the revisionist powers will set examples for other powers. The power of example is very strong. And if you seize territory on whatever claims, historic, legal, made up, others will be tempted to do it if it appears to be without penalty. So where are we going today? And I think we are seeing the end of a hegemonic order. I think the United States no longer wants to bear that burden. It's turning inwards. It's, as I said earlier on, it's damaging its own capacity, I think, to influence events in the world, both through military power, but also through its knowledge and through its influence and through its reputation. I think we are likely possibly to see spheres of influence becoming more and more something that people talk about. I think it's not just the United States that is talking in this way. I think Putin definitely thinks in this way, and I think the Chinese probably do as well. But what that will mean for the world, I think, will not be comfortable. To be in anyone's sphere of influence without your choosing it, I think, is something that is difficult. And these are likely to be autocratic, undemocratic spheres of influence. Difficult to tell quite how far the United States will go down an anti-democratic and autocratic path, but certainly there are the elements there which are worrying. And as I said earlier, the greater globalization of concerns is something that we are getting less and less equipped to deal with. If we turn into our neighborhoods, if we concentrate only on looking after our neighborhoods, who is going to be thinking about the world, about the challenge of climate change, about the challenge of artificial intelligence, which we haven't even talked about, and what does that mean for humanity? And so the question I will leave you with, and I'm afraid I have no answers, is can some sort of order be reestablished? Can we somehow get rules that are widely accepted and norms? And can we somehow encourage the aspirations towards cooperation, which have been there throughout history? I mean, I think there is great public support for nations not to fight each other, to work with each other. Can these somehow begin to push governments? Or are we facing 21st century models of the older types of anarchic orders or the dangerous orders, balance of power, great power competition, and spheres of influence. And I'm afraid we may be facing the latter. So I'm afraid I can't cheer you up very much. And I apologize again for forgetting Austria. Thank you. So, I don't know, isn't that awful? Dear me.
Margaret, thank you. Thank you so much. The clue was in Congress of Vienna.
I know.
And now, let me cordially invite you all to our flying dinner downstairs. Don't miss it. Thank you very much. And thank you, Margaret.
Oh, God. Well, honestly, what an ass.